Can someone tell us what we're waiting for?
Oh, they're rejoining the room. I guess there was a disconnect with the audio and video. So I just saw Christo rejoined as well as Peter. I thought it was just on my end. I was like, okay.
Yeah, I just saw everyone freezing for just a second and then.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for the hold. Yeah.
What we're waiting for?
Oh, they're rejoining the room. I guess there was a disconnect with the audio.
Yeah, so
I just saw Christo rejoined as well as Peter.
So thank you very much, and I'm sorry for that. But I think I left off introducing the Honorable Iba, member of the Riksdag from Sweden. Yeah, and I'm also happy to introduce the Honorable Mr. Uri. He's a member of the Knesset in Israel. So just a wave of the hand. And I'm also happy to introduce Lukwesa, and she's been a founding member of the master plan. She's been with us right from the beginning. She's been amazing in terms of giving us ideas, giving us opportunities in terms of how we can go this. So she's the Miss African Union 2019. Lukwesa, you can give us a wave. And then we're also joined by Mr. Samra Mohammed, who is the chief coordinator of the Collegiate Congress. And they have been very instrumental in the formation of the master plan and its continued sustenance. There's huge student movements in New York, and I dare say that, I mean, they really have that power to mobilize the students in the US. So Sam, you'd want to just give us a wave. Thank you very much. And lastly, we're also joined by Mr. Amilcar Sanatan. And Amilcar, to me, needs no introduction. So Amilcar is a steering committee member of the recently formed Global Students Forum, which is the organization that is supposed to give a global voice to all students. And over 174 student unions representing all the various regions. The Global Students Forum is that organization that currently gives students globally a voice. So we're represented by Amilcar. Amilcar, you'd want to give us a wave. Yeah, Amilcar. All right, so as I've indicated for today, we're celebrating the International Day of Education. And all of us will understand that we're doing so under very extreme circumstances. We've been hit by COVID in different ways. And I dare add that more than ever, education and students in particular have been more hit. And I do think that a discussion in a time like this is relevant for us to be able to see how best we can put education back on track, so that we don't lose an entire generation. And you'd know that the International Day of Education was adopted by the UN General Assembly on December 3, 2018. So this will mark the third International Day of Education. The last two we have observed together with the master plan, and this year has not been any different. So for today, for the speakers that we have who will be speaking on various dimensions of the theme that we have selected, we would be happy to see how we can sustain quality education even in the pandemic. And to start the discussion for us today, I'd welcome none other than Amilcar to take the floor. He would give a background of how GSF has accommodated COVID, how students from all over the globe have contributed variously to mitigating the effects of the pandemic on students. So Amilcar, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And I bring everyone warm greetings from the Global Student Forum. And I want to thank you for joining us to celebrate the International Day of Education. At best, we only have the ability to put forward recommendations for the short and medium term in light of the constantly changing circumstances related to the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet our analyses and insights on the present context draw attention to options and opportunities for our education system. Much has been asked of policymakers for innovation, but all innovations without an underpinning politics and commitment to educational justice would fail a generation of learners and educators. Today, I will share 2 points for consideration. 1, the need to develop national digital education strategy, and 2, the role of students in curricular development. In July 2020, throughout the Latin American and Caribbean region, it was reported that 8 of 33 countries provided technological devices to support distance learning activity. The majority of in the majority of countries, with the exception of Uruguay, did not have a sustained state policy that provides ICT devices, laptops, and tablets to students. In my context, Caribbean governments have turned to soliciting support from the private sector to assist with purchasing devices for students. The service gaps remain, and the possible return to face-to-face teaching delivery will not eradicate the step the world has already made, which is to harness the power of ICTs for education. As student organizations and movements, we must be on the front lines of ICT campaigns for education, since we have witnessed its significance to building resilience in education systems, responding to public health crises and disaster risk. Therefore, sustaining quality education would require co-created national digital education strategies with national student unions and education planners that provide affordable technology, mass-based skills training, the digitization of learning content, and policy that clearly tackles the use of proprietary goods and services. Another challenge we face is the continuity of education and learning curricula. Decision-making on the adjustments to teaching priorities will happen on a national basis. However, student organizations and movements must have a say on the approach of governments when schools reopen and face-to-face learning resumes. Universities have shown the ability to continue curricular delivery with the least amount of disruption. But primary and secondary schools have been forced to contend with wider populations of students from socially excluded groups. Pedagogical shifts and socialization with technology, changes in teaching hours, and the serious need to focus on fundamental subjects such as mathematics and language proficiency. As governments deliberate on some of these curricular matters, student organizations and movements must insist on a human rights-based approach to education that radically responds to inequalities of access and also promotes teaching and learning on just responses to the pandemic, social, economic, and ecological crises of our time. As I close, I would like to take the liberty to briefly describe the guiding objectives for the Global Student Forum on COVID-19 for 2021. 1, to challenge richer countries to invest in global education, particularly for children in vulnerable situations. 2, to call for the removal of debt and promote economically just financing for countries. 3, to advocate for the fair distribution of vaccines globally. 4, to mobilize student organizations and movements to adopt a pro-vaccine position and effectively address disinformation. And 5, to highlight inequalities and make recommendations on issues of access and uneven development in the education system during the pandemic. Thank you for considering the understanding and recommendations of the GSF as we work collectively to develop just, relevant, and sustainable educational systems throughout the world. Love and solidarity, solidaridad, solidarity.
Thank you very much, Amilcar. And I'm happy that you've touched on the COVID-19 vaccines, and you've touched on how students can contribute to the recovery process, so that it doesn't seem as though we're always good at smelling rotten eggs and we're not able to recommend how good ones should be laid. So we'll come back to a round of questions, but for our next speaker, we'll invite Mr. Sebastian Palacios, the member of the National Assembly from Ecuador, to take the floor.
Thank you, Peter. Hi, everyone. I guess this is our first meeting of this year, so I wish you all a happy new year to all the members of the master plan and to everyone that is following this meeting. We are definitely facing a tough reality. We are living in a sanitary crisis, a social, economical, and political crisis. So today that we are celebrating the International Day of Education, the question is, how do we avoid an educational crisis in our world? In Ecuador, in my country, there are 4.4 million students, from which 74% are registered in public institutions. I think we all agree that online schooling has its limitation regarding the effectiveness of learning. But when you live in a country, as mine, where only 37% of families have access to the internet, you have a serious problem. According to UNICEF, in Ecuador, 6 out of 10 children are not able to keep studying under virtual mode. The situation is even worse for some children that live in the rural areas. Only 16% of these families have access to the internet or resources to purchase technology. The Minister of Education has recognized that 70% of the students have problems accessing online education. You can imagine, with all this data, the inequalities that are increasing in our country, and I'm sure that in all your countries as well. So I'm gonna tell you how the National Assembly, the parliament in my country, have implemented some reforms and some new laws in order to tackle this problem. We have approved a Humanitarian Support Law, which specifically achieves the educational aspect with the following regulations focused in social welfare. All educational institutions have to reduce their rates up to 25% to all the parents who justify they have lost their jobs or they have suffered a reduction in their salaries. The educational service cannot be suspended for any reasons. The government will give monetary and non-monetary compensations to fulfill the educational obligations that most vulnerable segments of the population have regarding the first stages of educational system. All the governmental institutions related to education will have to give all the facilities so that educational institutions can implement the virtual mode in their systems. For all universities, they must increase in 10% the scholarships for all levels. And in those places where digital infrastructure is not appropriate or enough, the educational authority, together with the communicational authority, will establish mechanisms to give all students access to education. Regarding the executive power, the Ministry of Education have implemented 3 steps for the educational continuity plan, which are named Learn Together at Home is the first stage. The second stage is Learn Together and Keep Us Safe. And the third stage is Back to School. We are still going through the second step. So considering this, I am sure that these actions that we've taken are good, are necessary, but obviously we can do more. So local and national governments need to address the barriers of technologies to have access to the internet, so remote learning assignments can be done by all students. That is why we propose to launch an alliance with private companies so they can support countries and their cities to offer inclusive remote learning aligned with national curriculums in response to the closure of schools and universities. We know that digital education is based in technology and it must be adapted to the needs of students, but also to the needs of parents and teachers. So we propose to invest in family members as co-educators. Many families do not feel ready to take on the added teaching responsibilities they have given. And it is important to offer materials, workshops, or one-on-one support to families so they can build confidence in this new role. To create and make available interactive digital learning resources for teacher and parents. For example, free multilingual online apps to teach them how to learn online and how they can support students and community members that may be facing mental health challenges, problems as consequences of COVID-19. This crisis is a new opportunity for international collaboration. I think that is very, very important. Collaboration to prepare the young leaders for what the future might hold. Stronger international cooperation involving governments at different levels, companies, and international public-private partnerships might help provide a better focus, deliver solutions, and generate common digital goods. And emergency remote teaching or re-engineered distance education should have the collaboration of different shareholders, from psychologists through sociologists, therapists, to offer better and timely solutions. Producing solutions on broader grounds is vital because during times of crisis, delivering content to students is not only an issue concern. Caring and supporting learners at such time is also important. This is our reality, the reality of Ecuador. These are some of the tasks that we have and the actions that we have taken. I'm sure that this will help to your countries, to your work, to tackle the problem we are facing throughout the educational system in our countries and in the world. Thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you very much. And I do think that on the second round, I have a particular question of interest I would want to ask you. And I think that in large part, I know that you contributed to the drafting of the the campaign, and that was a very difficult time. And that was a time that, I'm not sure I should be saying that was a time, but the mental health of students have been hit, staying home, not just students, but young people, everybody has had like a strain. And so your role in doing that is something that I would want to raise with you on the next round of questions. The next speaker that I would want to invite is Honorable Joanna. And I would want to particularly hear from you how in the times that we have seen, especially in the context of human rights violations in the context of COVID, how has that impacted education? You do get a sense that we have not been able to mobilize in the traditional way that we do, for reasons of social distancing and all of that. We haven't been able to mobilize in a traditional way. How has that, had an influence? And you both as a legislator and also as somebody who is a former student and leader, I would want you to provide that sort of context by way of how education has been affected and at the legislative level, and also with your background in student leadership, how the human rights space has been constrained, and for that matter, the impact that it has had on education. Honorable Joanna, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Mr. Peter, for giving me this opportunity. And also let me commend the organizers of this event for allowing us to talk about the recovery and vitalization of education in this COVID-19 generation. And apparently, Mr. Peter, the fundamental questions that you're raising today, they're actually part of my presentation, because if we are going to talk about recovery and vitalization of education, we also need to talk about the issues of democracy and human rights issues. So it's also part of my presentation. So while I was preparing for these remarks, I dutifully studied the historiography of pandemics from the Russian flu in 1889, the Spanish flu in 1918 to the COVID-19. One thing that is more clear is that pandemics have killed more human beings than the natural disasters and even war. And yet, when COVID-19 struck in 2019, the world was barely prepared for this eventuality. This year's celebrations of the UN International Day of Education unfortunately coincide with the outbreak and proliferation of a pandemic that has disrupted learning at a global scale. It is appropriate, therefore, at this stage to begin to imagine what recovery and revitalization would look like for education sector in the era of COVID-19. First thing that we need to recognize is that the COVID-19 has exacerbated inequalities. As governments attempt to distribute resources, certain populations are left behind, worsening their situation. For example, 188 countries, we have schools that are closed for learners, but certain sections, they have remained in school via technologies and online platforms. The impact of these inequalities in access to education will be very massive because, for example, the global pandemic hit all of us without the infrastructure of outside classroom learning. About 90% of students in sub-Saharan Africa do not have access to household computers, and 82% lack internet. In the household, in the communities that I also relate with as a member of parliament in Zimbabwe, this is a sorry state because many learners do not have access to computers and internet. This is even worsened with the 12 hours power cuts and also out of reach charges for access to internet. COVID-19 has also led to some serious global threats to democracy and academic freedoms. This has created an environment which is not conducive for academic freedoms and freedoms of expression, which are fundamental to learning. In Zimbabwe, for example, learners, leaders of student bodies have been abducted, they've been tortured, they have been arrested. As I speak today, one of the student leaders, Alan Moyo, is actually in prison right now, and he has spent over 45 days without the constitutionally guaranteed bail, right to bail. In 2020, just last year, there was a massive increase in arrest and detentions of students, including that of the ZINASU president, Takudzwa Ngadziore, and a brutal abduction and torture of a university student by the name Tawanda Muchehiwa. This is very important for us to consider and also to, as we focus on the recovery and revitalization and strengthening of our education. Here are some of the things that we need to consider. But apparently the unfortunate incident is that here in Zimbabwe, the parliament is closed because of the national lockdown. So we haven't been able to meet as a parliament to deliberate on some of the issues that can be done to improve our education system. But first of all, what is needed to be done is to improve and promote democracy and human rights. The freedom of expression and academic freedoms are at the center for recovery in the education sector. There is need to support efforts by government and civil society to create equal and sustainable solutions to reduce inequalities, thereby improving the voice of women and girls, as well as students, to freely self-determine and chart a future that they can own. The UN, the master plan, and all the agencies that are involved in education must speak more against violation of fundamental human rights, as we have seen in countries like mine, Zimbabwe, and also countries like Uganda. The second thing we need to do as governments is to strengthen the budgets towards the education system. There is evidence that many governments are cutting budgets towards education sector as they focus more on COVID responses and economic recovery. This is, at this point in time, it's very important for us to strengthen the budget support, meaning that learners will have to return to schools safely and teachers have access to protective materials and equipment. This also must be strengthened with fighting corruption in our countries. In countries like Zimbabwe, where there's rampant corruption, we need to make sure that we fight this disease that is called corruption so that all public funds can benefit the intended beneficiaries. Also, there's a greater demand for students to be independent in learning. As we speak, Many learners have learned how to use Zoom and also other ICT tools. Thus, there has been an acceleration and a need to ensure that curriculum is geared towards independent learning. The role of teacher in supervision must be rethought. We must abandon the common adult-led learning to new innovative pedagogies that allow students with minimum supervision to actually learn on their own. More fundamentally, we need to rethink the role of young people in policy and leadership positions. It is us, the young people, who must drive the change and recovery of the COVID-19. For example, when we talk about the fourth industrial revolution, it is important, yes, to embrace technology, but also the access to education must never be compromised. We can also consider the issues of community networks, like we have seen in Argentina. Community networks, they are very key because they also allow easy connectivity, and they are cheaper and they are also reliable. The other important point to note is that the education system must support variety stakeholders who are key to the new ecosystem for learning. Like we have seen Marcus Rashford of Manchester United, how he has supported vulnerable kids by providing food. This means that the school system must engage outside its walls. It's time that we also consider engaging the private sector. So education is no longer just the business of government. We need to join hands and ensure that there's recovery and there's recovery in this sector. Then also, like what my colleague has mentioned, the issues to involve family members in the education sector. Before COVID-19, teaching was predominantly the burden of teachers, but the pandemic has thrust parents and family members a right to the center of learning. As part of the recovery, the role of parents and their engagement in the learning processes must be strengthened. So I feel there should be a mentoring program for parents to help them with homeschooling and stuff like that, so that they are equipped on how they can assist our learners going forward. And lastly, but not least, we need to recognize and honor the role of our teachers in our countries. In many African countries, the role of teachers remains undervalued and many under-remunerated. Given the sacrifices that teachers have gone through and the value they play in the education sector, there's an urgent need to relook and value their roles so that they can fully commit and release their full potential to our learners. As you have seen, that education is one of the biggest employer across the globe. Therefore, our governments must ensure there's social dialogue in our countries so that all the players, they come together and find ways of promoting decent work for our educators, that is our teachers. Thank you so much, Mr. Peter. These will be my submissions.
All right, thank you very much, Honorable Joanna. And I think that you've touched on all the relevant things, touching from human rights to the role of teachers to the civic space, etc. We'll come back to you in the second round. I've listed some questions. The next speaker will be Honorable Iba, and she is a member of the Riksdag in Sweden. So Honorable Iba, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, and hello everyone, and greetings from today's snowy Stockholm. I am really honored to have been invited to this discussion about the importance of education during the COVID-19 pandemic. This pandemic has proven to be one of the greatest challenges to our societies at the moment, forcing us to come up with new solutions for a new reality. When it comes to education, many teachers have had to learn how to navigate through a landscape of perhaps new technology, and also how to interact with their students over computer cameras and microphones instead of face-to-face in a classroom. In addition to school teachers, many parents have also had to take on the role of teaching their children from home, whilst doing their own jobs at the same time, adding extra workload for many women and men around the world. For the students themselves, it might prove to be more difficult for some to study from home, really putting their discipline to the test. We also know that many students come from homes where their parents can't help them with their studies, making it even harder for those who might need that extra help. I therefore believe it is really crucial that we find ways to offer support for students even outside of school hours. And one thing that has made me really happy is to see older students offering a helping hand to those who need it in Facebook groups or in other places, and this just proves how much we need to cooperate in trying times like these. And in terms of technology, I think we all can agree that it doesn't always work perfectly, as we saw in the start of this conversation, but during these rare circumstances, we must make of it the best we can. This also, though, highlights the importance of good and reliable technological infrastructure, and the access to good quality education cannot be dependent on where you live, but must be available to all, pandemic or not. Even when we can start talking about the world post-COVID-19, our modern societies will rely more and more upon technology, making this a problem not only of today, but just as much a problem of the future. My hope is that this pandemic has really highlighted the importance of schools having both the right and enough resources to offer proper education even when our world is put to the test. Even in Sweden, where education is accessible to all, it is crucial that teachers and students are given the adequate tools to handle a new and unexpected situation. That should also include, I believe, the possibility to take part in exams in some way. We don't want a situation where a whole generation's future is put on hold. Lastly, I would like to point out the importance of education during a time when all kinds of facts about the pandemic is being thrown around, particularly on the internet. Countries have adopted somewhat different strategies, but most of us now understands the importance of acting responsibly and, for example, practicing social distancing and have a proper hand hygiene. We can also agree that COVID-19 has taken the lives of thousands of people around the world and therefore cannot be seen as a typical cold. If we are going to fight this pandemic, we need to see common grounds and work together. And I'm convinced that young people, when giving high quality education, will play a vital role in that. I will stop here and once again, thank you so much for including me in this conversation and looking forward to the continued discussion. Thank you so much.
Most definitely, Honorable Eva. And in the second round, I would be interested in trying to understand from your perspective, not just in Sweden, but also when we talk about learning from home, when we talk about children getting access to, parents who can have the capacity to even teach them, and the absence of tech and gadgets and all of that. So in the second round, I would want you to be able to maybe be a bit broader in the spaces of where there are vulnerable communities who can't access some of these facilities. So for our next speaker, I'd want to invite Honorable Yorai, who is a member of the Knesset in Israel, to take the floor. So Honorable Yorai, you have.
Thank you so much, Peter. This is a great privilege to take part in this very interesting discussion about the future of our education in Israel and abroad. I'm also, like Johanna, the youngest member of the Israeli Knesset. I'm 32 years old, and I'm currently in the midst of my fourth running to the parliament. We are currently in general elections in Israel in 57 days, and therefore I wouldn't be able to stay for the second round, so I'll make sure that I'll address most points during this first talk. Well, Israel is currently in its third general lockdown, and I've just come back from the Knesset. We had a special session on education, on the Education Committee, which I'm a member of, discussing how to enable schools to have their finals exams right now during the lockdown. And when I'm thinking about it, we had dozens of discussions about how to conduct the education and how to enable during the corona. And with respect to what you asked, Peter, about the main conclusions that we can draw, well, I think when I'm thinking about it, that it's a bit too early to draw definite conclusions, but I think that we can point out some general directions which are very good, and that we can build on those directions. And the first one is kind of practical. Israel has already gave or offered its citizens vaccinations, and over 30% of Israel's population has been vaccinated against the coronavirus with Pfizer and now with Moderna. And with respect to the special role of the teachers, this population of teachers and of educators were offered first come, first serve. They were offered the first vaccines across the country. And I think that most of the teachers and educators chose to get vaccinated, and so that they can go and do their job freely and with a bit more personal security about their ability to perform and safeguard their entire environment. And now, in order to allow the high schoolers to go and do their finals, Israel has opened vaccinations for 16 to 18, so that in 2 or 3 weeks' time, every high schooler would be able to get vaccinated and to perform and do the exam without any fear of getting infected with COVID. So that's about that. I think that in general, the coronavirus has raised us a few challenges and allowed us to reaffirm the basic assertion about the importance of education in our country, or in the priorities, and it's supposed to be on the top priority. And I think that Israel has managed that in that sense, where it said that whenever we have a lockdown, the first thing that would be returned to normal business would be education. Schools were open first before businesses, before commercial markets. We chose to send the students back to school because we said education first. And so that gave us a chance to reaffirm our basic assertion that we first and foremost invest in education. And I think that, as I said, there are many challenges that the corona has brought up, and our job was to turn those challenges into opportunities, which means that we could realize our most deepest dreams about what education should be, which means that we need to develop hybrid system of learning, which means that half of it needs to be a virtual learning through computers and through Zoom. Half of it should be outdoors through promotion of the informal education. We promoted many educational programs focused on informal education. And in this time, in this crisis, I think that the informal education, if we said it's in a very valuable part of the educational stripe, I think that in this case, I think it's the most important part of the educational stripe. And in the, no one mentioned it, but I think that one of the most important conclusions that we drew from the corona is that we need to strengthen the independence of the principals and of the educational teams of the teachers and educators in Israel, and to empower them with the authority to make their own decisions about how to conduct their education, and empower principals to make decisions, not only be responsible, but also get the authority to create education and make real decisions about how to open and conduct the education in their schools or in their district. And I think that specific resolution has proven itself as very useful, as many principals chose one path and others chose different paths. And we had a lot of different options to observe and compare and recommend. I mean, there were very much discussions with principals throughout the country. Most of the kids in Israel, about 95%, go to public schools, which are 100% public funded. And so we could have really open discussions about how to improve education, how to take it to the next level. My only hope, Peter, is that we will be able to sustain the huge investments that Israel has made to education and to allow those small groups of people, the hybrid system of learning and the empowerment of those educational staff continue onwards, because I think that we can draw a lot of opportunities from this very difficult and straining times. So I have to go now to a virtual town hall about the climate change and how Israel can do better in fighting it. But I want to thank you all the participants, all the members of parliament. It was really inspirational to hear you speak so emotional and so, I mean, it was amazing. So thank you very much for the opportunity to listen. And I hope to take part in many more meetings in the future. Thank you so much and have a beautiful day.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Yorai, and we're sorry to see you leave. And I do think that in the submission that you've made, you have at best tried to give us your thoughts insofar as what has been done in Israel is concerned, and for you as a young person in the Knesset, also your contributions on what you think should be an appropriate way forward. And you're right. I do think that in the subsequent conversations, we would want to hear a lot more from you, especially as you will not be able to join us for the second round of the questions that we have.
I'll just say that I hope that our next meeting will be in person and in Jerusalem. We'll be very happy to have you and host you guys in the Knesset and speak about education, which is, in my view, the most important part in everyone's life.
Absolutely. So
have a nice day. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
You have a nice time to ensure that
Shalom.
Subsequent discussions. So our next speaker is someone who is very familiar with the master plan, and like I've indicated earlier, has been with us from the onset. She understands the principles of the master plan. She's been there with us, and we want to hear from her. And I do think that part of her conversations would center largely on what her role has been, and largely how the space of between Africa and her experiences in the US, and just trying to get how we can sustain education during this most difficult time. So, Lukwesa, you have the floor.
Hi, everyone. So first, I would love to thank the ASU, as well as the Global Student Forum, for hosting this wonderful initiative on education, because it's such a critical subject, particularly in light of the pandemic. And as all of the amazing panelists have said before me, there's so many indisputable facts and effects of this pandemic on education that are very disproportionate across the globe. So rather than going over a lot of the facts that were already stated and the disaster effects, I'd like to go into more of how we can turn these challenges into opportunities, but also how we can learn more and develop new ways and methods of creating more accessible education going forward. And so as we see with virtual learning that's taking place, we see that a lot of virtual technologies are in use that allow children to be interactive, as well as students, even people in high school, as well as college. But the issue with this is, while most of developed countries have access to these resources and reliable bandwidth for internet and are able to interact, ask questions, as well as submit their responses to other peers, in countries such as countries in like Southeast Asia, such as Indonesia, where only 35% of the population has access to a working computer with internet, or in countries such as Uganda and a large portion of Africa, they are basically well behind this gap. So what this pandemic has done is created a greater disparity between those with access to these resources and those that don't have access. So I think that while it has been challenging to adapt to virtual learning, the disaster of the pandemic compounds those issues for underdeveloped countries that don't have access to these tools. And so my call is to really promote and encourage students as well as youth organizations and people in Parliament, as well as Congress, as well as all the different levels of policy within governments in their respective countries, to really pay it forward and put that notion out that while we're still grappling with this pandemic and ways to virtually learn, other countries don't even have access to those gateways and ways that they can come back from this. And organizations such as the Literate Earth Project, Room to Read. I personally am involved with the Literate Earth Project, and what they do is create digital and traditional forms of literacy through books and through engaging teachers on site to teach children how to read and write legibly, how to use these digital books, to look up something on Wikipedia or even engage in learning Uganda-centric books, such as in the case of Uganda. And so I think that rather than focusing on the issues, we need to extract all of the opportunities that this is affording us. For instance, the Research Institute of America has done a profound research study on the effects of virtual learning. And while many may think that it's a lot harder or it's less useful than in-class learning, they're actually showing that there is a 25% to 65% retention rate. So when you look at that, you start to think of ways that we can set the stage for a future where we can adapt to these challenges and build on them, so that once we're out of this and once we've kind of build back as a society to become something different, because things will never go back to the way they were, I believe that they'll become better because we are more resilient and we're more responsive to these challenges and how we can sustain that future. And so my call is to really focus on how virtual learning can help, how to improve the quality of education materials, and how we can use these issues to really set a silver lining and help these disadvantaged populations, not just focus on our issues, but focus on those issues that are affecting the livelihoods and rights and ability to even access those same luxuries that we have, such as in America. I live in America. And so my call is to really just kind of balance out the scale and think of creative ways of promoting the transfer of digital transfer of literacy, whether it's promoting books or even donating to causes that take part in these kind of initiatives. But I think that we all have a part in this role to balance out those scales until this pandemic is resolved. And so that would be my call, and just to focus on the positivity of it.
All right, thank you very much, Lukwesa, and thank you for sharing that everybody should be involved in the recovery. I will take a last speaker, Sam, who is the Chief Coordinator of the Collegiate Congress, and Sam has been very pivotal to the master plan. I mean, I saw whether I'm with you campaign launch, I've seen how the launch of the master plan. In all the activities, Sam has just been an amazing person. So Sam, you have the floor, and I'd want you to share with us mainly what the Collegiate Congress too has been doing in these times. And I think that you can overlap into the master plan because, I mean, you do have an understanding how the workings have been. So you have the floor.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, everybody, on today's for celebrating the International Day of Education. I am delighted to share the happiness of accomplishment with my Collegiate Congress and Collegiate International families. Years ago, we created a diplomatic academic program for students in the United Nations headquarters. Students were provided a first-hand international learning experience taught by the United Nations diplomats, and specifically by UNITAR, which is the principal body responsible for training of diplomats and officials throughout the United Nations. So while this is not the first contribution from Collegiate Congress to the world through the United Nations, we are looking forward to the next adventure. We are directly proud of our accomplishment, because traditionally, student organizations have continually been the forefront of social reform and education reform in particular. Thus, we set out to follow the footsteps of those who have come before us, as well as blaze new trails, pushing for new accomplishment and higher learning as we go. We are confident that all have more to learn in turn. Everyone has much to teach. With new resolution, we built around 3 core principles. The first, celebration of education in all its forms. Second was a pervasive acknowledgement of everyone who is in the academic sector. No one should be made to feel excluded, not to exclude all the contribution by the United Nations agencies such as UNESCO, UNITAR, and UNICEF. We must remember the sacrifice and those who have dedicated their lives to the field of education. So, dear friends, we are going through an unprecedented crisis that we never expected nor prepared for. The pain and misery that we see around, particularly losing loved ones, have left an unerasable scar on many of us. This pandemic has not spared any sector, including academics and students. In New York City, we invested all of our financial and administrative potential in serving our students' community, and to a certain extent, to their families. The issues are prevailing, and with the rise in numbers of deaths and hospital cases, particularly in New York City, we are exhausted. However, we are not backing off in the helping of our fellow students. The issue are among many academics in the service of depression and suicidal ideation among students, being away from friends and their families. Being away from their friends and families, limit their freedom to travel, has created a new pattern so we have a provision of self-schooling. So these all new experience for students, that you have to go through online learning, not going to school, not interacting with other students, have created a kind of depressions, social anxiety. So we are at Collegiate Congress taking the effort into consideration as students have realized to their social responsibility. This also created the I Am With You campaign, along with ESU, AASU, OCLE, and Young Democrats of America, Youngest Parliamentarian, and the Ambassador Advisory Board are thanked for creating the campaign I Am With You, a global campaign advocate for depression and suicidal ideation. I am confident that our joint effort through the Master Plan, UN initiative, we shall overcome. Without education, there will be no peace. Thank you, Peter. I turn the thing to you.
Thank you very much, Sam. And I would want to take on the second round of presentations. And this time around, I would pose a question to the panelists, and then I'll give you the opportunity to respond. So I'd want to start with Honorable Sebastian. I'll start with Honorable Sebastian from Ecuador. You've mentioned largely the intent for us to look at private and public partnerships. And I do think that more than ever, we realize that education is a public good. And I do get a sense that everybody who looks at this and looks at the extent to which students have been denied education, not because they want to, but the circumstances has just pushed them out, especially those in the public space. So you realize that those in private schools have continued to learn, and those in the public institutions have had to remain out of learning. That would imply that those in the private schools would leapfrog those in the public sector. So to what extent is funding by way of supporting education largely as a public good help us in this era? Because we're talking about a time that is not usual. So I want to understand the extent to which you think that the private sector should come in that will not serve as a detriment to the large masses who would otherwise, in the absence of public education, be denied access. So I think that I would want to understand how your context, come in by way of, and then before you sign off also, as I've indicated earlier, you were key in the drafting of the I'm With You and the campaign. And so before you sign off, having answered the question, I'll be very excited if you rally everybody around the campaign and to let people understand that, yes, mental health does take a toll on everybody. And signing on to the campaign indicates that we all do understand, the problem, and that we're willing to come together to solve it. So, Honorable Sebastian, you have the floor.
Sure, Peter, thank you very much. First of all, I'll have to say that I really agree with Luquesa about viewing this situation not only through the problems, but through the solutions and as opportunities. And in my first speech, I was saying that it is very important to make relations and to make agreements with the private sector, not necessarily talking about giving the service of education, this human right that all youth and children have, but as to give the elements, the resources that our youth need in order to have a good education. I was telling about the lack of access to internet, for example, in a lot of communities, especially in rural areas in our countries. So if we have these alliances between public sector, between local governments and companies that offer the service of internet, and we make this kind of alliances, I think that we are going to reduce this amount of people that can't access to internet, especially in order to guarantee education. I would have to say about the second thing you mentioned, and this is very important, Peter. We all in this group met and wrote all the strategy in order to take the I Am With You campaign to a document. We already have a document with all your contributions, with all your ideas, and that is great. That is a very good opportunity. And in this document, Peter, as all you know, we added sports as a powerful tool to tackle mental health problems in youth. And sports is always connected to education. And I would have to take this final seconds in order to request all of you to support the International Sports Week. We as a group proposed this to the UN. We are proposing this in our own countries, a whole week, so that all the institutions, public and private institutions, focused on how to promote sports and how to make people do sports every day. So yeah, I would like to request that support, and obviously to request the support specifically in the Sports International Week. Peter, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. And I would want to follow up with Amilcar. And you would know that as student groups, we do have a way of demanding accountability. And you know that the way that we do it has been appended. I mean, in that we're not able to, for example, mobilize in the numbers as we would traditionally do due to lockdowns. We're not able to, for example, go to government offices because of COVID. And so we're not able to demand accountability in the usual way that as students would mobilize. So the question is, seen as education funding is being cut down. And so countries clearly have moved in a matter of priority, seem to be looking at COVID-related expenses. How education is not COVID-related, honestly, it beats my imagination. But I mean, clearly it is the case that funding is being, cut away from education into other sectors. How do we, that we're constrained is one factor, that we can mobilize in the way that we do is one factor. What innovative ways can we still use to hold our leaders accountable to be able to spend the resources which they take in our names? Because as they take these loans to service COVID-related expenses, it is our generation that will come and pay off these debts. And I do think that we have a responsibility to, as it were, demand how those monies are being spent. So I'd want you to share with us, how do we, in the difficult times that we operate in, how do we come together to demand accountability in these times?
There's no problem. Thank you very much, Peter, and much respect to everyone who presented earlier, because I'm quite inspired by the multiple contexts I had to learn from. You know, I have to make a very honest submission here. It's a lot of unsexy work to make these demands. I think what we come to terms with is actually limits of advocacy. Many of us in the leadership of student organizations have the privilege, the status, and the visibility to articulate demands on certain platforms, but also have the ear of some leaders. So inclusion of high policy decision making is very important, but that is not enough. We need to build our capacity to audit national budgets. If we don't do that, we always have a recommendations that either sounds too expensive, is not being discussed in the context of national security, which has the highest budgetary allocation in some countries like Haiti, Jamaica, Trinidad, parts, you know, of Latin America, of course. So this is a conversation, of course, the broader social sector. We are having a conversation on education, but it's that kind of development consciousness and a development justice that must ground the way that we approach this discourse, this type of politics. So I think there's a little bit of homework on the side of the activism. And we have seen outstanding student unions like ASU that have provided this type of technical reports and advocacy at multiple levels where we could do mobilizations. Another part of it would be challenging the notion in COVID-19, which is that critique is rendered as complaint. In a moment where there's so few participants in national media, and there's a centrality of the state to lead conversations, when one has a contrary view, it seems as if one does not have the interest of the collective, that you are trying to undermine the government, and everything is seen as political opposition and not critique and expanding the stakeholders at the table. And we have seen in economic recovery committees, they have drawn primarily from major industry at the expense of social sector participation or civic organizers. So from the beginning, our inclusion has to be in the very specific areas about where does the state solicit opinions and perspectives to do it other than the cabinet, but also, as I see fora like these, try to engage progressive politicians to really include parts of our agenda and negotiate it, because for a long while, we sometimes shy away from the political reality, but that is the ultimate expression of our desires because they are political. We need to have politicians who see our agenda as critical and engage in that process. It's unsexy, it's longer, it's difficult, but moves from advocacy into activism.
Thank you very much, Amilcar. I would want to ask Honorable Joanna. I don't think there's anyone better equipped in the panel to answer the human rights question than Joanna. So Joanna, I would want to understand, we do know that clearly COVID has some leaders, I don't think, it's COVID in itself, but some leaders have taken advantage of COVID to shrink the civil society space. Would want to know from your perspective, to what extent do you think that international solidarity would be relevant to play a role to bring pressure to bear on the leaders to respect democratic values and norms? As it is, you've tried to explain in your earlier submission that education cannot thrive in a space where democratic values are absent. So as we do this, we're mindful that there needs to be that space, that opportunity to still, take on democratic norms and democratic values. So Joanna, I would want to hear from you. To what extent do you think that international solidarity would be relevant to be able to help to protect the civil society spaces?
Thank you so much, Peter, for that important question. And let me also say that the panelists have really shared great ideas in light of the recovery and revitalization of our education system. I have actually learned so much in terms of how other countries are doing it in terms of tackling this important issue. But coming to your question that you have talked about, I think the first thing that we need to recognize, like what I've said, is to recognize that there has been threats to democracy and academic freedoms, because that's the first step in terms of finding solutions. Because if we don't recognize that fact, it means then we can't have a round table to be discussing solutions. So in a country like Zimbabwe, for example, we need to understand that our human rights, they've been violated so much, to the extent that even student leaders themselves, our stakeholders, different stakeholders in the education sector, they can't even speak out. They can't even, stand up to give suggestions to the government, because at the end of the day, what they have to face is obviously detention, the arrests, and also abductions and so forth. So this is the most important thing that we need to recognize. Then secondly, I also feel that in this COVID-19 era, what I feel is very important is social media creativity. I think we have seen in the just ended elections what was happening in America. How the former President Trump was put down, from Twitter. You see, that was, that means, social media has become one of the most important tools in our activism or in our democracies. So I feel that as young people who are trying to push issues to do with education, let's make use of social media. If it means creating our hashtags that would then, end to the recovery and revitalization of education, let it be. We need solidarity from GSF, solidarity from all students, all Africa Students Union, all Students Union. They have to come together, create solidarity on social media so that we can be heard by our governments and also globally. Then also at the end of the day, what I also think is that, the government is up there. Then also we have families, how families are trying to make sure that their learners, they're educated and they're not, left out with the, with what is happening in our systems. So what is needed right now is to create that space between something that is bigger than the families where we are in, because the families are a bit smaller. Then also the governments, they are huge, they are bigger. So, what is needed is to create a space between our families and also our governments. So there's this huge vacuum that we need to fill, and it can only be filled by us, the leaders and also, activists, so that we can, have a round table, have discussions to deal with how we can make sure that we promote democracy and human rights in light of COVID-19. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Honorable Joanna. And I would want to take Honorable Iba, I'd want to ask, and I think that I did give you a hint of what I'll be asking you. And I do, based on the work that we've done so far, there is a realization that stay at home, for example, doesn't mean the same thing for a child who can't afford 1 square meal. Stay at home doesn't mean the same thing for a child who doesn't have a shelter over the head, not to talk of internet access. And so while we make policies that seem to, as it were, improve technology, make it accessible and all of that, there are a lot more people who are even denied the opportunity at the first place. So as a legislator, how do you look at it by way of inclusivity? Those who don't have access, they are from vulnerable and marginalized backgrounds. And also the fact that as we begin to look at it, we realize that COVID has taught us that everyone's problem is everyone's, problem. You're just there and something comes from somewhere. And so we cannot look only inside, we have to look outside too as well. So how do you bring the perspective of inclusivity together with the recommendations that you've made earlier?
Thank you for the question or questions. I have to admit, though, I'm not an expert on rural internet, but I do think that both Luquisa and Sebastian make some really clever remarks on the subject. What I can say, though, is that I think that first of all, we need to redefine what infrastructure means, because in 2021, infrastructure probably doesn't mean what it meant some years ago. You know, it's not just about having functioning roads or, traffic anymore. It's a lot bigger than that. And in a time where so much of the discussions and the political debates take part and place on internet, it really becomes a democratic problem when so many people don't have access to these forums, to these platforms, to the discussions, and perhaps also not to information. One thing also that I would like to highlight that makes me a little bit hopeful, actually, is that I genuinely believe that the generation which is growing up now is in a lot of ways a lot more engaged in society than I believe previous generations were. And we're seeing so many fantastic initiatives from young social entrepreneurs who really cares deeply about not only their own communities, but the world as a whole. And that makes me really hopeful. So asking me if I have any quick fix on how to fix this problem, I would have to say, unfortunately, that I do not. But we do really need to also work together. And I think this initiative within the UN and all the different students, organizations, and young leaders who are in parliament or in government, we need to recognize that this is just not a problem for some people. This is a problem for all people all over the world. And I'm from Sweden, and we don't really have the problem on the scale as perhaps in a lot of other countries. That does not mean the Swedish people shouldn't care. Perhaps we should care even more about these problems. So national and international cooperation really invest in the next generation, not only politically, but also entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs, and all those other fantastic initiatives that are taking place. And also redefining what infrastructure means in 2021. That would be my remarks. Perhaps not a clear answer, but at least some insights from me. Thank you.
No, I think it helps, absolutely. I think it helps to say that we might have to define some normative terms that we have used. So, for example, do we still see internet as a luxury, or it is now a need? Do we still see roads, hospitals? So we need to, like you're saying, redefine a lot of the things that we've taken for granted to mean certain things. And I do think that once we begin to redefine them, they begin to give us a sense that we must now relook at how they are funded, how they are accessible to everyone, and how they're opened up. So yes, I mean, it's very helpful that, I mean, you've ended on the note of redefining them. Lukwesa, I think that you did more of trying to give us a roadmap. I think you did more of trying to inspire us. I think you did more of trying to rally everyone together and to give us an understanding that it won't take an individual entity, it won't take a particular person, but it's the responsibility for everyone. And I do think that we've seen a lot of that. Even as we saw xenophobic tendencies, we did see racist tendencies, but we also saw an increasing tendency of institutions, even entrepreneurs, even profit-making entities coming out to also show love, show the intent to also help. So just a closing remark is pretty much one that is blank for you to just make a closing statement, and then I'll come to Sam. So Lukwesa, closing remarks.
Yes, no, I really do appreciate hearing all of the ideas and incentives for recreating and you know, redefining what it is that we need to focus on in light of this pandemic. And I do agree that the focus should not just be on disadvantaged populations, but also ours and how we can work together locally on a national level as well as international. And I think that it would help. My master's is in public policy here at Johns Hopkins, but in doing that program, I learned that policy is not just the issue, but how it's enforced and then how it's implemented. So I think that when we encourage everyone to take a part and kind of define what that part is, and then everyone is working in tandem on those parts, coming together and you know, discussing the recourse on what is the outcome of this? You know, if we do X, Y, Z, what are the most possible likely outcomes of that? And really getting together and banding together with these ideas and policies and then implementing them. For example, you know, here in the States, they've started doing, certain school districts have started combining resources to actually do virtual learning and creating similar curriculums so that students are on the same page. Even radio stations have started broadcasting different types of virtual learning. On an international level, for instance, BBC has their own podcast for primary and secondary homeschool learning called Bite Size Daily. So if you look at all of these innovative ways of getting around the issue and making it a solution, I think that that's where the focus should be. And again, it is all of us. And I think it's more critical now than ever to think of how we as individuals can create change, you know, not just through promoting and not just through engaging people in parliament or, you know, leaders at the top who are making these decisions, but really rallying and advocating for those changes that we wish to seek and doing our part, whether it's writing an idea or discourse and sending it to someone who, you know, that can get that influence, whether it's through social media or whether it's even through engaging in platforms online where they discuss these forums and bring it to light within organizations or protest or peaceful protest, I should add. We've seen the other side of that recently, but whether it's through all of these different forums, particularly social media, because that's gaining a lot of momentum. I think that once we share these ideas, it opens the gateway for other people to then look at these ideas and think, okay, how can we make this tangible? How can we make it something that can be followed upon and create the steps to implement those ideas? And so I think that that's a very critical aspect, is not just to think of it and voice it, but to think of strategies and tactical strategies and ways that these ideas can be heard and implemented.
Okay, thank you very much, Wesa. And Sam, it looks like you'd have to give us the last closing remarks. So share with us your last thoughts for the International Day of Education. I would think that it's an opportunity to rally the parents, the teachers, everyone who under various circumstances in different ways have sacrificed. Because I do think that, I mean, everybody has tried to do their bit to be able to make sure that we have carried ourselves in a manner that we can have hope. So your last remarks, and then I'm sure that we'll be able to bring this session to a close. So Sam, you have the floor.
Thank you, Peter. My last remark is it's our commitment to follow the guideline of New York State and the federal government here in the US, because our numbers in New York are going up, and it's a bit different from around the world. However, we need to focus more on how to introduce the students to online learning and to become a part of the anxiety and make an awareness about it. And this is how Collegiate Congress is committed to help other students, but also in getting funding and delivering foods to students in need and provide them with financial services to continue their education. Thank you, Peter.
Okay, so thank you very much, Sam. Thank you very much, Iba, Lukwesa, Joanna, Amilka, Sebastian, and Uri, who had to leave us to be able to attend the meeting at the Knesset. I would want to thank every one of you. I do know that we're all busy, especially the parliamentarians, all of us. I do know that we all have very tight schedules. So to be able to make time for a 2-hour session like this, I do think that, I mean, all of us deserve to be but it does tell what we're passionate about, and you'd realize that everybody spoke from the heart. Everybody really spoke in terms of the passion, in terms of the commitments, in terms of what we want to see. And at various levels, we've all seen in our various organizations what we've done to be able to alleviate the toll of the pandemic. And I do also want to thank Thomas. I mean, I always use the platform to indicate that, I mean, Christo is one person who sacrifices a lot to make sure that he brings all of us together. He does it to the detriment of, I mean, his own resources and all of that. So as much as we do this, we have to keep also remembering that, I mean, he's a single person who envisaged this, put this together, and as many parliamentarians as have come together, we're beginning to see the fruits. I mean, for example, if you take Philippines, I mean, the International Day of Education is today something that is recognized nationally, and because of a member of parliament who is part of the master plan who has, I mean, facilitated this. And we do get a sense, for example, like the I'm With You campaign and the sports week that we're suggesting. So all of these initiatives are driven by the members of parliament that form the core part of the committee. And I think that in great part, it's all because we're able to have this conceived by Thomas. So on today, we have taken the time to thank our teachers, we've taken the time to thank our parents, we've taken the time, all stakeholders, the tech, I mean, industry and everybody. And I do think that we all acknowledge that the road ahead is much tricky, and it means that we all have to keep playing our part. And I do think that we're not going to end the conversation here. We'll keep having them, we'll keep sharing ideas, we'll keep coming together to exchange ideas on how best we can come together to do this. So on that note, let me say thank you to everybody, and it's been amazing moderating this and meeting wonderful people like you. So we'll still stay in touch and we'll keep doing what we do best. And good evening, thank you very much. So I think that we can all turn on our cameras and then just do this. Yeah, so.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you so much, everyone.